the United States government once dosed a single patient with LSD for 174 days straight, not as punishment, not as treatment, as an experiment. And that wasn't even the worst thing they did. Between 1953 and 1973, the CIA ran a covert human experimentation program so extreme that when it was finally exposed, the director of Central Intelligence told Congress he was, and this is his word, on record, under oath, horrified by what his own agency had done. They called it science. Think about what that means for a second. The most powerful intelligence agency on Earth, the same agency that told the public it existed to protect American democracy, running secret experiments on mental patients, on prisoners, on ordinary people who walked into a doctor's office with anxiety and walked out, years later, unable to remember their own parents' names, unable to speak, unable to control their own bodies. The program had 149 subprojects. It operated through 30 universities and institutions. It reached into hospitals in Kentucky, into federal prisons in Atlanta, into a safe house in San Francisco, decorated with French paintings, where men drank spiked cocktails and were watched through one-way mirrors by a government agent who later wrote to his boss that the whole thing was, quote, fun, fun, fun. There was a man named Frank Olson. He knew what was happening inside this program. 9 days after being secretly dosed with LSD, his body was found on a New York City sidewalk beneath a 13th floor hotel window. The government called it a suicide. His family called it something else. This is the story of MKUltra, what it actually was, what it actually did, and why the techniques it invented didn't die when the program was supposedly shut down. Because here's the thing they don't put in the press releases. The program didn't end. It just became something harder to see. If you watch this channel, you already know that the most important stories are the ones someone worked very hard to destroy. MKUltra is that kind of story. And there are more where this came from, every single week. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to where this started, further back than you'd expect. The CIA spent an estimated $10 million on MKUltra, roughly $87 million in today's money. That figure sounds large. But the real cost isn't measured in dollars. 185 researchers and assistants worked on this program across at least 30 American and Canadian institutions. They worked in hospitals. They worked in universities. They worked in federal prisons and psychiatric wards. Many of them didn't know who was funding them. Many of their subjects didn't know they were subjects at all. They called it science. The people who went to the Allan Memorial Institute in Montreal for help with postpartum depression didn't know they were entering a CIA-funded laboratory. They didn't know that the doctor treating them believed he could erase a human personality, like wiping a chalkboard. Some of them came out of his care unable to speak, unable to recognize their own children, incontinent, permanently damaged. Some of them were never right again. The people who volunteered for what they were told was a schizophrenia study in an Atlanta federal prison didn't know they would be given LSD every day for more than a year. One of those people was Whitey Bulger, the Boston crime boss. He later said the experiments destroyed something inside him that never came back. Here's what makes this more than a Cold War horror story. The techniques developed inside MKUltra didn't stay in MKUltra. They were written into a classified CIA interrogation manual in 1963. That manual was used in Vietnam, in Latin America, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in secret CIA prisons after September 11th. The people who didn't know this history lived inside its consequences without ever understanding why. The next time you hear about enhanced interrogation, that's the thread. It goes all the way back to a basement laboratory in Montreal and a safe house on a hill in San Francisco. The question at the center of this story isn't whether the CIA committed crimes. The documents prove that it did. The question is, how did they hide it for 40 years? And why did they need to? To understand MKUltra, you need to understand 1953. Not as history. As a state of mind, the Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear bomb in 1949. American soldiers returning from Korean POW camps were parroting communist propaganda, and nobody could explain it. The phrase brainwashing entered the American vocabulary as a genuine fear, not a metaphor. Newspapers ran headlines like, "New Evils Seen in Brainwashing." The Manchurian Candidate wasn't fiction yet. It was a policy concern. It was in this climate that CIA Director Allen Dulles stood before an audience in 1953 and condemned what he called Soviet brain warfare as nefarious, abhorrent, antithetical to American values. 3 days later, he approved MKUltra. This is the moment that's worth pausing on. Not because the hypocrisy is surprising, but because it tells you exactly what this program was. It wasn't a deviation from American values. It was a decision made by men who genuinely believed they were protecting those values, and who were willing to do anything to win a war they were terrified of losing. That's not a defense. It's an explanation. The most dangerous people in history are rarely the ones who thought they were doing evil. They're the ones who were completely certain they were doing good. The man Dulles chose to run the program was a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was brilliant, methodical, and possessed of a conviction that the ends could justify almost any means. He had a clubfoot and a stutter. He kept goats on a farm in Virginia. He practiced folk dancing. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely odd man. And, behind a desk at Langley, he became, in the words of journalist Stephen Kinzer, the architect of the most sustained search for mind control techniques in history. They called it science. Gottlieb had a theory. The human mind, he believed, could be unlocked with the right chemicals, the right pressure, the right sequence of shocks and stimuli. You could strip a person down to bare circuitry and reprogram them however you wanted. A perfect spy, a perfect witness. And if the Soviets had figured this out first, if they were already building weapons from human consciousness, then the CIA couldn't afford to wait for ethics committees. To test this theory, Gottlieb needed subjects. The problem was obvious. If you're running illegal human experiments, you can't exactly put out an ad. His solution was simple, brutal, and it worked for 20 years. In the early 1950s, Gottlieb arranges for the CIA to purchase the entire world supply of LSD from a Swiss pharmaceutical company. The price, $240,000, roughly $4 million in today's money. The CIA now controls the global supply of the most powerful mind-altering substance ever discovered. Gottlieb begins distributing it to hospitals, clinics, prisons, and institutions across the United States, asking researchers to study its effects. Most of those researchers have no idea where the funding is coming from. Their subjects have no idea what's in the drink. And it gets worse. Gottlieb doesn't just fund outside researchers. He also tests LSD on CIA employees, on military personnel, on doctors, on government agents, and when he wants to see what happens to someone who doesn't know they've been dosed, in a social situation, without any clinical framing, he builds what he calls safe houses. In 1954, Operation Midnight Climax opens for business. CIA-run apartments in San Francisco and New York City, decorated with French paintings, stocked with food and drinks. CIA-paid women bring men back to these apartments. The men's drinks are laced with LSD, and behind a one-way mirror, a federal narcotics agent named George Hunter White watches. He watches for hours, sometimes while drinking martinis. He later writes to Gottlieb about his years running these operations. His own words, "Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill and cheat, steal, deceive, rape and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? It is preserved. It is real." They called it science. But here's what you haven't heard yet. Midnight Climax is just one of 149 subprojects, and the most destructive one isn't happening in San Francisco. It's happening in Montreal inside one of the most respected psychiatric institutions in North America. And the man running it is the sitting president of the American Psychiatric Association. In January 1957, Gottlieb targets Dr. Donald Ewen Cameron. Cameron is the head of the Allan Memorial Institute at McGill University. He's internationally respected. He's currently serving as president of both the American and Canadian Psychiatric Associations. He will later become the founding president of the World Psychiatric Association. Cameron has a theory of his own, that mental illness is the result of ingrained behavioral patterns, and that if you can destroy those patterns completely, wipe the slate clean, you can rebuild a healthier mind from scratch. He calls this depatterning. Then, psychic driving. The CIA calls it exactly what they've been looking for. Through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, the CIA funnels $69,000 to Cameron between 1957 and 1964. Cameron never asks where the money is coming from. He already has the theory. Now he has the resources to push it further than any ethics board would have ever allowed. His patients come in for anxiety, for postpartum depression, for minor psychological conditions. They come in for help. What Cameron does to them is this. He keeps them in a medically induced sleep for days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. One patient is kept sedated for 86 days. He gives them massive, repeated doses of electroshock therapy, far beyond any clinical standard of the era. He injects them with LSD. He puts speakers inside their pillows and plays looped recordings of his voice for up to 20 hours a day. Some patients hear these messages more than 500,000 times. He calls this process of total psychological erasure the creation of a blank slate. The blank slate comes. But what Cameron promises, that he can rebuild a healthy mind from nothing, never materializes. What he leaves behind, instead, is wreckage. Patients forget how to speak. They forget their parents' names. They forget their own children's faces. They lose control of their bodies. At least some of them never recover. In the medical records of one patient, Esther Schreier, an entry dated March 12, 1960 states simply, "She is considered completely depatterned." Esther was pregnant at the time. Her son, Lloyd, is still alive. He is still fighting, as recently as 2024, to be recognized as a victim. And remember what I said at the beginning, that the techniques didn't die when MKUltra was supposedly shut down? Here's the evidence. And once you see it, the rest of this story will never look the same. Because this is the part most people don't know. And it's the part that connects everything. In 1963, the CIA produces its KUBARK Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual. It is classified. It is over 100 pages long, and it is a direct product of MKUltra research. The KUBARK Manual explicitly references a number of experiments at McGill University. It recommends sensory deprivation, drug-induced regression, the deliberate destruction of a subject's psychological defenses to produce what it calls a childlike state, one receptive to programming. These are not abstract principles. They are the documented methods of Ewen Cameron, codified into official CIA interrogation doctrine. This is the point of no return, the moment after which it becomes impossible to claim this was simply misguided science. Now let's talk about November 1953, before the program is codified, before the manuals, before the cover-ups. A scientist named Frank Olson works at Fort Detrick, Maryland. He's a biological warfare specialist, one of a small group of people who knows everything about MKUltra's darkest activities. He has witnessed things he cannot unsay. He has traveled to Europe and seen what he later describes to his wife as extreme interrogations. He has watched men die in CIA experiments conducted in secret overseas prisons. He has decided he cannot continue. On November 19, 1953, Olson attends a CIA retreat in Deep Creek, Maryland. His colleague, Robert Lashbrook, Gottlieb's deputy, pours Cointreau into glasses for the group. Olson's glass is laced with LSD. He is not told. He returns home a changed man. He tells his wife he wants to resign. He says he's all mixed up. His supervisor talks him out of resigning. He is sent to New York for what he is told will be a psychological evaluation. 9 days after being secretly dosed, he is in room 1018A of the Hotel Statler. He folds his laundry. He calls his wife. He says he is feeling better. In the early hours of November 28, 1953, Thanksgiving weekend, his body lands on the sidewalk of 7th Avenue. The government says, suicide. Robert Lashbrook, the only other person in the room, cannot remember whether the window was open or closed. He does not call the police. He makes a phone call. The person on the other end says, "Well, that's too bad," then hangs up. In 1975, 22 years later, the Olson family finally hears that Frank was dosed with LSD before his death. The government offers a settlement and an apology. They take the money. They don't accept the explanation. In 1994, Frank Olson's son Eric has his father's body exhumed. A team of forensic investigators examines the remains. They find a hematoma on Frank Olson's temple, a wound consistent with a blow to the head, a wound not listed in the 1953 autopsy. The New York Medical Examiner reclassifies the cause of death from suicide to, and this is the official designation, unknown. No charges are ever filed. No one is ever prosecuted. Here is what actually happened. Here is the answer to the question this story has been circling. MKUltra was not primarily a mind control program. The CIA's own 1963 KUBARK interrogation manual, which directly references the McGill experiments, encodes MKUltra methods not as science fiction, but as doctrine. Historian Alfred McCoy argues, with documentary evidence, that the CIA deliberately framed MKUltra as a mind control story to prevent people from looking at the real goal. Developing systematic methods of psychological torture for use in interrogations, the techniques worked, not for mind control, for breaking people, sensory deprivation, drug-induced regression, sleep disruption, forced repetition, systematic dismantling of identity. These methods were field-tested on unwitting patients in Montreal, on prisoners in Atlanta, on men in San Francisco safe houses who thought they were at a party. They were refined over 2 decades. They were written into classified manuals, and after September 11, 2001, they were deployed in CIA black sites in Thailand, Poland, and Lithuania, on prisoners who were waterboarded, kept in stress positions for days, confined in coffin-sized boxes for hundreds of hours. The 2014 Senate Intelligence Committee torture report documented this lineage. Sidney Gottlieb retired in 1972. He told Congress the entire program had been useless. He died in 1999. He was never charged with a crime. Richard Helms, who ordered 20 years of files destroyed, was never charged with a crime. Donald Ewen Cameron died in 1967, before any of this became public. The person who wiped the slate of MKUltra's history is the same person who perfected wiping the slate of a human mind. They called it science. The documents call it something else. In December 2004, the National Security Archive and ProQuest published a collection of over 1,200 MKUltra documents, records that survived Helms's purge. Researchers are still going through them. Victims' families are still requesting formal apologies. As of 2004, the Canadian government has still never issued a formal apology for what happened to Cameron's patients at McGill. McGill University has never issued one either. Lloyd Schreier, the son born while Esther was undergoing Cameron's experiments, was denied compensation by a Canadian court as recently as the 1990s. He is still fighting for recognition. He is still alive. The next time you hear the phrase, enhanced interrogation techniques, the next time a government official explains that certain methods occupy a legal gray area, that certain contexts require extraordinary measures, you now have a name for where that logic was born. You have a room number, 1018A, Hotel Statler, New York City. You have a date, November 28, 1953, and you have a pattern, because here's what the documents show across every phase of this story. It was never the absence of rules that allowed MKUltra to happen. Rules existed. The Nuremberg Code existed. Informed consent requirements existed. What allowed MKUltra to happen was a decision made deliberately at the highest levels by men who knew exactly what they were authorizing, to place themselves above those rules in the name of national security. That's not an accident of history. It's a recurring feature of it. They called it science. The 149 subprojects call it something else. The family of Frank Olson calls it something else. The 77 patients in Montreal who were paid $100,000 each, without anyone admitting liability, Call it something else. The question isn't whether this happened. The documents are out. The question is, what do we decide to do with the fact that the people who built the interrogation architecture of the 21st century learned their craft in a psych ward in Montreal, a safe house in San Francisco, and a hotel room on Thanksgiving weekend, 1953? That's not a question with a clean answer, but it is a question that deserves one. If this story made you feel something, put it in the comments. What part of this do you think deserves a full investigation today? And if you want to understand how programs like this get authorized, protected, and covered up, that pattern runs through more history than just MKUltra. That video is waiting for you right here. Subscribe if you want to keep looking directly at this.